Gray morning in Berlin. In a dimly lit bunker, Hitler hunched over reports, his eyes scanning lines of numbers, maps, and photographs across the room. Luftwaffe officers shifted nervously, aware of the growing storm. Intelligence briefings spoke of wave after wave of American bombers, their formations crossing the continent with uncanny precision. Hitler's jaw tightened. Each B-17 and B-24 that pierced the European sky was a message. Germany, its defenses were faltering. Outside, the distant drone of engines rolled across the countryside. Radar blips flickered like warning lights. German flak guns rose. But too often they found only empty sky. Civilians in small towns paused to look up, sensing the approaching thunder. While soldiers braced for raids they could neither stop nor outrun. The Reich's pride, its air supremacy, had been breached, and yet this moment was not born overnight. It was the culmination of decisions, miscalculations, and momentum that Germany could never reverse. From Hitler's dread in the bunker to the relentless hum of American bombers above, a single truth emerged. The skies were no longer German. By the late 1930s, Hitler's Germany had remade its military into a machine built for rapid, overwhelming strikes. The Luftwaffe, still young but disciplined, was celebrated as a symbol of modernity and power. Pilots were trained rigorously. Aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Heinkel He-111 were cutting edge, and German military planners envisioned the skies as a domain of unquestioned dominance. Blitzkrieg depended on this aerial superiority, the coordination between tanks, infantry, and planes proving devastating in Poland, France, and early campaigns across Europe. Yet, beneath the veneer of invincibility, cracks were beginning to appear. Germany's industrial base, though efficient, was limited in scale. Factories were spread across vulnerable regions, resources were finite, and fuel production relied heavily on synthetic methods that could not match demand. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States was quietly assembling a different kind of arsenal, one measured not in tactical brilliance alone, but in sheer capacity. American aviation was growing at a pace that Axis powers could scarcely imagine. Companies like Boeing, Consolidated, and North American were mass-producing bombers and fighters at numbers Germany could never hope to match. The B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator were not just planes. They were symbols of a national industrial will, built to traverse oceans and overwhelm enemy skies. Pilot training programs churned out thousands each year, while Germany's pool of experienced aviators was slowly diminishing, eroded by attrition on multiple fronts. By 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor and America's formal entry into the war, the scale of this industrial and military potential became impossible to ignore. While Hitler focused on rapid victories in Europe and the Soviet Union, the United States mobilized not just to fight, but to dominate. Strategic planning began in Washington and London, plotting long-range bombing campaigns that would bring German industry into the line of fire. Targets were chosen with care: ball-bearing factories, aircraft plants, oil refineries, the very arteries of German power. Even German intelligence recognized the emerging threat, but the full extent of American capacity was underestimated. Radar could detect bombers, flak could respond, but the Germans lacked the manpower, fuel, and depth to sustain defense against an enemy who could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. By the time the first waves of long-range bombers reached industrial hubs deep within the Reich, the imbalance was already clear. The Americans were not merely flying planes. They were executing a calculated strategy backed by a nation's unmatched resources, training, and technology. From Hitler's perspective, the problem was not bravery or skill. It was scale. The Reich could fight on multiple fronts, but it could not stop a flood of machines produced by a nation whose factories never slept, whose pilots were trained in months what German crews learned in years. And so, as the winter of 1943-44 pressed in, the stage was set for a struggle that would test not just German defenses, but the very idea that Hitler could command the skies. This imbalance, born of industrial foresight and logistical mastery, would define every clash in the months to come. The seeds of Germany's aerial collapse had been sown long before the first American bombers screamed overhead, and understanding them requires tracing both the technological advances and strategic choices that made the Reich's defeat in the air inevitable. While Germany relied on precision and skill, the United States relied on scale, innovation, and logistics. By early 1944, America's aviation industry had matured into a machine capable of producing hundreds of bombers. Each month, Boeing's Seattle plants churned out B-17s at a pace that German anti-aircraft defenses could not match. In California and Oklahoma, Consolidated Aircraft and North American Aviation were constructing B-20 for Liberators and P-51 Mustangs with unprecedented speed. Each plane represented more than firepower. It was a statement of industrial inevitability. The Reich's reliance on synthetic fuel and dispersed production only deepened the imbalance. Oil shortages constrained fighter operations, limiting sorties and reducing the Luftwaffe's capacity to intercept American formations. Factories producing aircraft and engines were constantly threatened by sabotage, air raids, and the logistical bottlenecks that came from operating under a shrinking resource base. Germany could produce technically advanced aircraft, but never in the quantities required to contest sustained air campaigns over Europe. Meanwhile, Allied planners in Washington and London meticulously prepared for strategic bombing campaigns. The point-blank directive, issued in 1943, outlined a systematic effort to destroy German aircraft production and fuel supplies. Before the Normandy invasion, intelligence reports, photo reconnaissance, and cryptographic breakthroughs enabled planners to select targets with surgical precision. The Americans were not improvising, they were applying scientific analysis to warfare, creating conditions in which Hitler's Luftwaffe would be forced to fight on increasingly disadvantageous terms. Pilot training in the United States also outpaced Germany's capacity to replace losses. German aces were exceptional, but attrition steadily eroded their numbers. American flight schools graduated thousands of pilots annually, trained in long-range navigation, formation flying, and bombing accuracy. By contrast, the Luftwaffe faced a dwindling pool of veterans, increasingly inexperienced replacements, and an air war that was growing beyond their operational reach. Technology further tilted the scales. The P-51 Mustang, equipped with drop tanks, could escort bombers deep into Germany, a capability the Luftwaffe had no adequate answer for. Radar and early warning networks provided the Americans with situational awareness that German defenses struggled to match. Even innovations like the Me-160 jet fighter, potentially a game-changer, were deployed to late and into few numbers to halt the relentless wave of Allied air power. By late 1943, it became evident that the German military machine, formidable in the early blitzkrieg campaigns, could no longer respond effectively to this new kind of war. It was not merely a question of courage or strategy. The Americans had brought to bear an industrial and technological scale that Germany could not hope to counter. Hitler's obsession with control, his insistence on micromanaging tactics, and his misallocation of resources compounded the problem. Each American bomber that crossed the continent was a tangible reminder of the Reich's growing vulnerability, and yet, this imbalance was more than a technical or logistical issue. It was psychological. Reports of massive formations, unbroken by German defenses, began to unsettle the high command. Civilians and soldiers alike would witness the distant thunder of engines, a sound that heralded destruction and underscored the futility of resistance. The American approach was methodical, relentless, and inevitable, a combination of strategic foresight, industrial power, and human endurance. This context, the confluence of resource advantage, technological innovation, and training depth, set the stage for the multiple perspectives through which the struggle would unfold. Understanding the scale of American air power is essential to grasp why Hitler's strategies failed, why the Luftwaffe could not recover, and why the skies over Europe were destined to belong to the Allies. By 1943, the United States had transformed its civilian economy into a wartime powerhouse. Factories that once built commercial airliners, cars, and consumer goods now produced bombers, fighters, engines, and components on an unprecedented scale. Boeing's Seattle plant alone could assemble dozens of B-17 flying fortresses each month, while North American Aviation in California produced hundreds of P-51 Mustangs and trainers to sustain the pilot pipeline. Each assembly line moved with clockwork precision, overseen by engineers and supervisors who had adapted industrial mass production techniques to the demands of war. German intelligence and planners struggled to grasp the scale. Even as the Luftwaffe deployed new aircraft and refined tactics, the sheer volume of American planes in production outpaced the best German defensive efforts. Factories were protected by camouflage, dispersal, and limited anti-aircraft defenses. But no measure could match the speed and consistency of American output. The U.S. had embraced redundancy. Thousands of workers, vast supply chains, and raw materials that flowed uninterrupted. Industrial power translated directly into the air war. American formations could replace losses faster than the Luftwaffe could inflict them, maintaining relentless pressure over Germany's industrial heartlands. By the time German anti-aircraft gunners corrected their aim or scrambled interceptors, another wave of bombers was already on approach. Hitler and his generals understood this imbalance, but correcting it required resources and foresight Germany simply no longer possessed. The scale of American industrial output was more than numbers. It was an operational philosophy. Germany had built brilliance and precision into its forces. America had built inevitability, and in the skies over Europe, inevitability began to matter more than skill, even as German pilots fought courageously. Their efforts were constrained by dwindling resources. The Luftwaffe relied heavily on synthetic fuel, produced in refineries that were increasingly vulnerable to Allied bombing. Each sortie demanded careful planning, and shortages limited operational flexibility. German interceptors often launched with half-strength fuel loads, forcing pilots to abandon engagements or retreat prematurely. The United States, by contrast, operated with near unlimited access to aviation fuel, both from domestic oil fields and refined overseas imports. Bombers could reach targets deep within Germany without restriction, escorted by long-range fighters capable of extended sorties. Logistics, long the silent backbone of war, became a decisive advantage. Fuel depots, supply trains, and airfields were systematically planned to support sustained campaigns, a contrast to Germany's stretched and vulnerable infrastructure. Hitler's fixation on immediate tactical victories exacerbated these limitations. Resources that might have strengthened defensive capabilities were instead diverted to secondary theaters or hoarded for grandiose projects that could not alter the outcome. For every American raid that reached its target, the Reichsfuel reserves diminished further, reducing sortie rates, limiting pilot training, and eroding morale. In the theater of air warfare, logistics was not invisible. It was visible in every bomber formation that crossed the horizon, in every Mustang escort that kept German fighters at bay. The United States had mastered the art of sustained operational reach, leaving Germany perpetually one step behind. Technology was both weapon and shield in the struggle for aerial supremacy. The U.S. pioneered long-range bombers equipped with Norden bomb sights, radar navigation, and self-sealing fuel tanks. The B-17 Flying Fortress, with its multiple defensive gun positions, could survive encounters that would have downed earlier aircraft. The Beta for Liberator, with extended range and payload capacity, allowed Americans to target factories, refineries, and airfields deep within Germany. Fighter technology further shifted the balance. The P-51 Mustang, powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, could escort bombers all the way to Berlin, protecting them from the Luftwaffe's interceptors. German innovations, such as the Focke-Wulf FW-190 and later the Me-160 to jet, were impressive, but they arrived late or in insufficient numbers to stop the tide. Radar, navigation systems, and intelligence coordination gave American air commanders real-time awareness that German planners could rarely match. The integration of technology with training, production, and logistics created a self-reinforcing advantage. Each American aircraft represented more than metal and engines. It was part of a system that Germany could observe, adapt to, but never fully counter. Hitler's attempts to redirect technological resources, the Me-160 to program advanced flak systems, jet prototypes, came too little, too late. Every innovation the Luftwaffe deployed was met by American adaptation, replacement, or sheer numerical dominance. In the air, technological superiority was decisive not because it was flashy, but because it was reliable, sustainable, and integrated into an industrial machine that Hitler could not match. Hitler's approach to aerial warfare revealed a fatal misalignment between ambition and reality. Insisting on micromanaging tactical decisions, he often diverted resources to grandiose projects or secondary theaters, neglecting the immediate crisis in the skies over Germany. The Luftwaffe, once agile and decisive, became hampered by conflicting orders, unrealistic targets, and delayed reinforcements. American leadership, by contrast, emphasized coordination, delegation, and adaptability. From the combined bomber offensive in England Commanders meticulously planned each mission, integrating fighter escorts, intelligence, and weather forecasting. Decisions were grounded in real-time reconnaissance, cryptographic intelligence, and industrial awareness. Hitler's attempts to counter the U.S. strategic bombing campaign, including dispersing aircraft and fortifying flak batteries, were reactive, always one step behind an opponent who dictated the pace. Strategic miscalculations compounded tactical difficulties. Hitler underestimated American endurance, believing Germany could recover from losses through rapid replacement and elite training alone. By the time he recognized the scale of the threat, U.S. bombers had already penetrated the Reich's most vital industrial and logistical nodes. Leadership decisions at this stage were too rigid, too delayed, and too relying on hope rather than actionable intelligence. Numbers alone were not sufficient without skilled operators. American pilot training became a force multiplier. Cadets underwent rigorous, standardized programs emphasizing formation flying, navigation, gunnery, and long-range endurance. Graduates joined units already integrated with tactical doctrine, radar guidance, and operational planning. Within months, thousands of new pilots were ready to maintain the pace of relentless bombing campaigns. The Luftwaffe, once the envy of Europe for its seasoned aces, struggled to replenish its ranks. Attrition was severe. Experienced pilots were lost in combat, leaving inexperienced replacements to face overwhelming odds. Training schools could not match the speed or scale of U.S. programs. Young German aviators, often barely ready, were sent into battles that demanded years of experience. Further tipping the scales. By late 1943, the imbalance was stark. American formations arrived in Germany with hundreds of pilots who had trained in months what their German counterparts required years to master. The result was a vicious cycle. Experienced German pilots were consumed in defensive efforts, while fresh American pilots arrived faster than they could be countered. Even the most skilled defenders could not overcome the cumulative advantages of the U.S. war machine. Radar stations became overwhelmed, flak batteries misaligned, and fighter units stretched beyond operational capacity. Each wave of American bombers penetrated deeper into Germany, leaving destruction in its wake. The psychological impact on German commanders and civilians was profound. Reports of bomber streams, escorted by P-51s and unbroken by Luftwaffe attacks, instilled fear and disbelief. Hitler himself was reported to express frustration at the unbelievable resilience of American forces. Generals feared sending young pilots into near-certain death, while citizens learned to gauge approaching raids by the ominous, relentless drone of engines. Morale, already strained, began to crack under the weight of inevitability. American air power was not only a physical threat, but a mental one. The enemy understood that losses were replaceable for the United States, but catastrophic for Germany. Each successful raid reinforced the sense of futility. Over time, defensive strategies became increasingly desperate, reflecting not tactical ingenuity but fear, an acknowledgement that the Reich was on a path it could not reverse. February 20, 1944, the skies over northern Germany erupted with the roar of American bombers. Known as Big Week, Operation Argument was a calculated strike targeting the Luftwaffe's aircraft factories, radar stations, and repair depots. Over 5 days, the United States Army Air Forces unleashed over 3,000 heavy bombers and 900 escort fighters, each formation meticulously planned to overwhelm German defenses. Intelligence had pinpointed production hubs at Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and other critical sites. This was not a raid. It was an orchestrated assault on the very heart of German air power. German radar operators detected incoming formations hours in advance, yet the defenders were unprepared for the scale. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulf scrambled in waves, often engaging only fragments of the American formations. Flak batteries, though dense, could not cover every approach path. Each bomber, shielded by formation flying and escorting P-51 Mustangs, pressed toward its target with a relentless sense of purpose. By mid-morning, smoke and fire began to rise from the factories below. The Luftwaffe's operational network, once precise and confident, was being shredded by numbers, technology, and strategy working in unison. Hitler monitored the progress with increasing disbelief. Reports flooded in, hundreds of German aircraft destroyed on the ground and in the air, pilots killed or captured, and critical components lost. Even elite units found themselves outmatched and outnumbered. Commanders attempted to redirect resources, But every movement was anticipatory. The Americans were already steps ahead. Each bomber that survived the flak and fire screens validated the U.S. industrial advantage, proving that losses were insignificant against a system designed to replace them immediately. The human toll was staggering. Young German pilots, some barely trained, faced formations of B-17s bristling with defensive guns. Flight crews worked tirelessly under freezing temperatures, firing at distant silhouettes that seemed impervious to damage. Civilians observed the distant trails of engines, the rising plumes of smoke, and felt the tension of a war that was increasingly dictated by forces beyond their control. Fear, frustration, and all mixed in the minds of those on the ground. By the final day of Big Week, German morale had suffered a decisive blow. The Luftwaffe could no longer mount sustained interception efforts, and the American command had gained critical intelligence on German radar networks, production sites, and defensive weaknesses. Hitler's strategic vision, already compromised by overextension and resource scarcity, was now visibly faltering. The enemy's psychological collapse mirrored the physical one. Confidence in the Reich's air defense had been shattered. This relentless pressure and operational superiority were a prelude to the turning point in the aerial war. The skies over Germany, once a domain of Luftwaffe dominance, were now contested and increasingly controlled by American bombers and fighters. The stage was set for the final unraveling of Hitler's aerial defenses, where technology, numbers, and leadership converged to create a tipping point the Reich could not reverse. March 1944. The Luftwaffe, battered by Big Week, faced a reality that Hitler had refused to acknowledge. The skies over Germany were no longer theirs. American formations now moved with near impunity, escorted by the long-range P-51 Mustang, whose arrival changed the calculus of every engagement. German fighters, once feared across Europe, struggled to reach the bombers before they struck their targets. Those that did engage often faced overwhelming defensive fire, a mix of heavy gunners in the bombers and agile escort fighters executing coordinated attacks. The raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg epitomized this shift. Ball-bearing factories, essential to German machinery, were systematically destroyed. Hundreds of bombers dropped tons of ordnance, devastating assembly lines, storage facilities, and transport networks. Flak batteries fired relentlessly, but the Americans adapted, maintaining formation integrity and pressing through with calculated precision. Reports from the field described pilots and ground crews stunned by the sheer audacity and scale of the attacks. Even experienced Luftwaffe commanders admitted they could not replace losses fast enough to mount a credible counter. Hitler's desperation grew. Plans for the Me-160 jet fighter, meant to restore air parity, were delayed and mismanaged. Fuel shortages prevented full-scale deployment, and Hitler's insistence on using jets as bombers rather than interceptors wasted their potential. Command decisions became increasingly erratic. Elite units were thrown into futile engagements. Training was curtailed, and reserves were misallocated. The human cost was severe. Young pilots with minimal experience faced elite American formations, suffering heavy casualties. The psychological toll mirrored the physical. Luftwaffe officers reported growing panic among crews, a sense of inevitability that the American air machine could not be stopped. Civilians, once reassured by propaganda of German air superiority, witnessed distant bomber streams and the smoke rising from industrial centers. Fear and disbelief spread through both military and civilian populations. Hitler himself, isolated and enraged, was forced to confront the failure of his strategic assumptions. The Reich could not match the United States in scale, endurance, or technological integration. By late spring 1944, German air defenses had been irreversibly degraded. The combination of numerical superiority, pilot training, technological innovation, and logistical planning allowed American bombers to dominate the skies. The collapse of the Luftwaffe was complete not in a single moment, but as a culmination of sustained pressure, attrition, and strategic foresight. Hitler's inability to counter American air power had reached its zenith. The Reich's remaining resources could slow, but never stop, the relentless advance of the Allied air machine. This decisive moment paved the way for the next phase of the war. With the Luftwaffe neutralized, the Allies could conduct large-scale strategic bombings without significant interference, directly shaping the conditions for the Normandy invasion and the eventual liberation of Western Europe. The turning point in the air war, born from industrial might, leadership, and tactical innovation, had shifted the balance irreversibly. The toll on the Luftwaffe was immediate and devastating. By the spring of 1944, German aircraft losses during strategic bombing raids had reached unprecedented levels. Factories producing fighters, bombers, and engines were systematically destroyed, reducing output just as the attrition of experienced pilots intensified. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and FW-190s were lost faster than they could be replaced, and spare parts became scarce. Even elite squadrons, once the pride of the Reich, faced the grim reality of dwindling strength and mounting casualties. Pilot shortages became acute. German training programs could not match the scale or speed of American pilot production. Young aviators were thrust into combat with minimal experience, often against overwhelming numbers of American bombers escorted by P-51 Mustangs. Veteran pilots, exhausted and overstretched, were lost in engagements that might have been survivable under earlier conditions. The loss of mentorship and combat experience further eroded operational effectiveness. The physical destruction was mirrored by strategic strain. Hitler's insistence on controlling every aspect of the Luftwaffe had created bottlenecks in decision-making. Commands for defense, redeployment, and counterattacks were delayed or contradictory, reducing the flexibility necessary to respond to the dynamic American strategy. German air defenses, from flak batteries to radar networks, were increasingly overstretched, forcing units to operate reactively rather than proactively. American air dominance forced Germany to make desperate, often ineffective adjustments. Jet programs like the Me-162, which could have posed a significant threat, were delayed or misused due to strategic indecision and logistical limitations. Fuel shortages further constrained operations, preventing the Luftwaffe from mounting sustained counterattacks. The cumulative effect was a collapse not in a single battle, but across the operational system. A military machine once feared throughout Europe was now struggling simply to defend its own skies. By mid-1944, the psychological impact on both soldiers and civilians was evident. Reports from field units described widespread demoralization. Aircrews feared encounters with American formations, and ground personnel recognized the inevitability of destruction from above. Hitler's generals, once confident in German air supremacy, now confronted the reality that no single initiative could restore it. The American air machine had not only destroyed material assets, but had sown a pervasive sense of inevitability. The Reich could resist only in part and only temporarily. The stage was set for the next phase of collapse. With the Luftwaffe weakened and German production severely hampered, the skies over Europe had shifted decisively. American bombers could operate with increasing freedom, and strategic planning for the forthcoming invasion of France would proceed under conditions shaped directly by air superiority. The consequences of Hitler's inability to counter U.S. air power were now tangible, both on the battlefield and in the minds of those fighting beneath the cloud of bombers overhead. By the summer of 1944, the consequences of Hitler's inability to counter American air power were fully apparent. German air defenses had been systematically degraded, leaving critical industrial centers, transportation networks, and military formations exposed. The Luftwaffe, once a pillar of the Reich's military might, could no longer contest the skies with any lasting effectiveness. Fighter losses outpaced replacements. Flak batteries were insufficient, and strategic coordination had broken down under the relentless pressure of Allied raids. The collapse of German air capability had immediate strategic implications. Allied bombers now operated with unprecedented freedom, striking targets deep within the Reich, disrupting production, and forcing the diversion of German resources from other fronts. Factories producing tanks, aircraft engines, and ammunition were destroyed or forced to relocate, further stretching Germany's already overstressed logistics. Each successful raid reinforced the operational imbalance, making it clear that the Luftwaffe could not recover in time to influence the larger course of the war. The psychological and operational impact on Hitler's command was profound. Reports of repeated failures, missed interceptions, and destroyed infrastructure fueled frustration and paranoia. Hitler's insistence on centralized control became a liability, as his micromanagement could not compensate for the systemic weaknesses that the United States exploited. Strategic initiatives, such as the deployment of the Me-160 jet, arrived late and in numbers too small to alter the trajectory of the air war. The dominance of American air power directly shaped the conditions for the Normandy invasion. With German air defenses diminished, Allied planners could coordinate landings with air cover, close air support, and interdiction of reinforcements. The Luftwaffe's inability to contest the skies removed a critical barrier to success, allowing the Allies to execute operations that would have been impossible under previous conditions. The dominance of American air power directly shaped the conditions for the Normandy invasion. With German air defenses diminished, Allied planners could coordinate landings with air cover, close air support, and interdiction of reinforcements. The Luftwaffe's inability to contest the skies removed a critical barrier to success, allowing the Allies to execute operations that would have been impossible under previous conditions. Every sortie flown over France or the Low Countries built upon the months of attrition inflicted on Germany, creating a momentum that Hitler could neither anticipate nor counter. Even beyond the immediate operational sphere, the collapse of Germany's air power reshaped morale, command structure, and strategic calculations. Soldiers and civilians alike understood that the Reich no longer controlled the skies. German pilots entered combat expecting heavy losses. Ground crews worked under constant threat of destruction. Hitler's strategic vision, rooted in the assumption of air parity or superiority, had failed. American dominance in the air was not merely a tactical achievement, it was a decisive factor in the eventual liberation of Western Europe. The long-term consequences were irreversible. Germany's industrial and military capacity had been compromised, its command structure strained, and its ability to conduct independent strategic operations effectively destroyed. The stage was set for the final months of the European conflict, a weakened Luftwaffe, unchallenged skies, and a series of Allied operations that would bring the war ever closer to the Reich's borders. The story of American air power over Germany is not merely a tale of planes, pilots, and factories. It is a testament to the scale, foresight, and integration of a nation's resources. Hitler's fear was real, his frustration tangible, and the Luftwaffe's collapse inevitable. The skies that had once symbolized German dominance were now filled with formations of American bombers and fighters, moving with precision, confidence, and an industrial momentum that could not be halted. This dominance reshaped the very nature of warfare. Strategic bombing demonstrated that technological innovation, training, and logistical mastery could overcome tactical skill alone. Germany's finest pilots, their most advanced aircraft, and even the visionary Me-160 jet could not reverse the relentless tide created by America's industrial and operational depth. Every raid, every destroyed factory, every lost pilot was a piece of a larger system, a system designed to exploit the weaknesses of a nation overextended and unprepared for sustained assault on multiple fronts. Yet beyond statistics and machinery, the story carries a human dimension. Pilots faced unimaginable risks. Crews endured long flights over hostile territory, and civilians lived under the constant shadow of destruction. On the German side, fear, disbelief, and despair spread among soldiers and civilians alike. The psychological weight of inevitability, watching the skies fill with American bombers, knowing that each sortie could not be stopped, was as decisive as the bombs themselves. In the end, Hitler's inability to counter American air power was not a failure of courage or talent, but a failure of scale, foresight, and adaptation. The United States had created not just planes, but an unstoppable system. The skies of Europe became a proving ground for the industrial, technological, and strategic might of a nation mobilized for total war. And from this lesson emerges a simple truth. In modern conflict, the combination of vision, resources, and execution can determine outcomes far beyond the battlefield, shaping history itself.